Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 89 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. I was looking to do something to honor June being Pride Month, and luckily, an anonymous listener wrote in a question that fit perfectly. However, I don't belong to the LGBTQ community, and I wanted to make sure their voice was represented in the conversation, so helping me tackle this inquiry is YouTuber, podcaster, and all-around good person, JennytheGeek, who also happens to be a trans woman. We had a few technical issues, so the sound isn't quite at the quality I would prefer, but I think it's still definitely worth a listen. Let's go ahead and introduce Jenny and the question for the show. As I mentioned up top, we're here with JennytheGeek. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And now we've talked a bit online, and I was very thankful that you agreed to join me on this. Why don't you give the listeners a little bit about your background and, how you got into comic books and that sort of thing, your history with the medium.
I've been reading comics. I actually don't know how long, maybe since I was 5. I was lucky enough to be adopted into the medium, I guess. But yeah, cartoons and just all that just raised in like the early 2000s superhero boom, thankfully.
So you're a little younger than me. I was born in the 70s, so I was raised on the 80s Saturday morning cartoons like Super Friends and all that sort of stuff. And, the Batman Adam West show in syndication and old reruns and such. And then I invited you on the show for this topic because the question we got from a listener, let me read it out loud here. They said, in the past, you've talked a little bit about racial and cultural diversity in comics and some of the heroes from outside the United States. Is there much diversity when it comes to LGBT characters? Aside from Nia Nal in the Supergirls TV series, are there other trans characters in comics? I am transgender and would like to know if there are more characters that, at least in some way, represent me. And so I wanted to invite someone on who those characters, they do represent them. I didn't want to be the person straight-splaining to everybody the history of LGBT characters in comics, because while I've always done my best to be an ally, that's not my personal experience. And so I wanted to make sure that I included a voice who does share that experience and has a more personal connection to these characters.
Yeah.
And so we're going to break it up, and we're just going to talk about DC this time. I will come back and revisit this topic for Marvel, for Image, for other independent comics sometime down in the future. But thankfully, there are so many characters out there that we can talk about that we do need to break it up into the various companies.
Yeah.
When I first started reading comics, that was not the case. You could count the number of LGBT characters on one hand, and you could have had an accident losing fingers and still be able to count.
Yeah.
But one of the very first characters that we have is someone who's been around since 1987. And that was a character named Extraño, originally introduced in the Millennium miniseries and was part of the New Guardians. Have you seen any of his appearances? Have you read any of the stuff featuring him?
I don't think I have. Is this this is the one, the Millennium. Yeah, this is the one where they like made the unfortunately named Pie Face into a hero, right?
Yes, Green Lantern's sidekick, basically. Tom, I'm probably going to mess up his last name, but Tom Kalmatu or something along those lines. He is Inuit in ethnicity, and when he first appeared was given the unfortunate nickname of Pie Face. And he was one of the main characters in that miniseries, but they also tried to introduce a bunch of characters from around the world. That they were adding some diversity to the DC universe, so not everyone was from the United States. And this character, Extraño, was South American and was very stereotypically gay. He didn't quite speak with a lisp, but he referred to himself in the third person and called himself Auntie, and was always talking, and was just very much, that stereotypical mid 80s, this is what we think all gay characters are like. So while it's a first step, it's still unfortunately very tied down to those stereotypes, and probably not the most positive representation to join the DC universe as the first example of such a character.
Yeah, it's not great, and I don't know how to feel about making an original team for this. Like it's good that they like went out of their way to like try to make inclusive for the time.
Right. You always have to, well, you should try at least to kind of look at it through the eyes of that time period. And while with modern eyes it's kind of regressive and not a positive representation, at the time it was still groundbreaking and at least getting that foot in the door and starting to bring in representation.
Yeah.
And like I said, they also made sure to include characters from all around the world. Unfortunately, again, those characters mostly stuck to stereotypes. I talked a lot about that in the episodes where I talked about DC and Marvel characters from around the world and how they mostly get stuck with character names and abilities and such that are stereotypes of their home countries. And that's true for the New Guardians as well. But again, it's a start.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm might have been better, like, to have them like actually be called like a Justice League, maybe? Because then you're like saying like, oh, these characters are important enough to be Justice League members instead of. I mean, I have the benefit of retrospect because of, as far as I know, this series was not as successful as they thought it would be.
Well, I mean, the Millennium crossover itself, it was a big crossover in the day. I don't know how well it was sales wise, but it was something that was talked about a lot in the fandom. But yeah, all of the characters that were created for the series, I can't think of any of them that actually went on and had a long career. None of them got their own solo books. They had the New Guardians title for I think about 12 issues, and then they all just kind of disappeared. And Extraño got the worst treatment of those characters in that the team fought a villain called the Hemo Goblin, who was referred to as an AIDS vampire, and Extraño was infected with HIV and left the superhero life shortly thereafter and was never seen again until the New 52 reboot. And at that point was a completely different character.
Oh. Ooh.
Yeah. So we're not starting off on the best foot here, but things do slowly get better. Why don't we move on to the first character I met in the DC universe who identified as LGBT, and that's Pied Piper. Are you familiar with Pied Piper from the Flash comics?
A little bit. I mean, he's a bit self-explanatory, just like control over people with music.
Well, not necessarily control over people, but it controls sound and can make a bunch of different effects with that.
Ah.
And originally, when he first appeared in the 60s, he was a Silver Age Flash villain, and he had the traditional Pied Piper look of the pantaloons with the green leggings and that sort of thing. And then in the late 80s, maybe even the early 90s, he reformed and became an ally to the second Flash, Wally West. And we get this conversation with Wally and Hartley is his real name on the roof while staking out a location, and they're just kind of hanging out and talking. And Wally asks, a lot of people say the Joker is gay. Have you heard? Did you see that or experience that when you were a villain? And he's like, well, the Joker and I really didn't hang out. He was one of those guys who would murder you, as much as look at you. And so, I not really. I couldn't tell you if he was or not. In fact, I don't know of any villains any of the rogues who were gay, except for me, of course. And that's how he comes out to Wally. And Wally has a reaction that is very early 90s, want to be an ally, but still uncomfortable with it, sort of thing. Where he's like, oh, that's cool. Okay. Huh. Well, I gotta go. And it's really awkward in that first coming out scene. But Wally is a good guy, and immediately the next time we see them together, there's nothing awkward about it at all. He had kind of that momentary surprise reaction of not expecting it at all, but he continued to be Pied Piper's friend, and they were all, they always had each other's back. When Pied Piper got married, Flash was there. So it's a much more positive look. And the thing I liked most about the character as he was presented, especially during Mark Waid's run on the Flash, is that the fact that he was gay, it was never his defining feature. It was, he is a character. He's a friend of the Flash's. He's really good with anything sound engineering wise. He's got this history. Oh, and he happens to be gay. At least to me, it normalized it so that it wasn't like, here is the gay character. It was, here is a character who happens to be gay. It was never made like a vital plot point or his only defining characteristic, or that sort, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. Um, yeah, find, like, at least in my reading of Mark Waid, that he's pretty good with these, like, how to handle these things. His handling of, like, other, like, topics seem understandable.
Yeah, he handles them with the right level of sensitivity and acceptance.
Yeah.
Well, from there we move on to a few characters who are technically part of the DC universe, but are mostly associated with the Vertigo titles back when they were an active publishing line. But we have characters like Constantine, and then Wanda from the Sandman Game of You, and Danny the Street from Doom Patrol. How well versed are you with any of these characters?
John Constantine, I'm very familiar with. I've watched a few things and read a few things of his. Yeah, he's a pretty good gay, well, bi character. Um, I appreciate that he's like, no, not this like pinnacle of good, I guess.
Right.
Like, it's just an aspect of him instead of like being a big deal, but like he can still be like a jerk
Oh,
and a
definitely.
backstabber.
Yeah, John is not a superhero in any sense of the word. He is out for himself, and if he happens to do the right thing, doing something that is good for him, that's fine. He'll usually do the right thing if it's not too much out of his way, but is definitely not the moral upstanding Boy Scout of Superman or most any other Justice League member. There's a reason that he's on Justice League Dark in the comics.
And like I find like some writers like use bisexuality as like an unfortunate like 90s trope of like, oh, bisexual people are just like very dishonest and will just like throw away their romantic partners at just a whim and just like they're backstabbers. So it's like, no, like John is just already a backstabber, but it has nothing to do with like romance. It's just like he has more of a flings with people.
Yeah.
Like the closest I can think of is like Zatanna as a romantic partner.
I don't remember which animated film it was, but there was a showdown between Justice League Dark and the Suicide Squad. And Constantine's there, and he's like, oh, this is awkward. My ex is on the other side. And somebody's like, "But you and Harley Quinn?" And he's like, no. And then King Shark gives John a wink. And
Yeah. See that scene, it's great.
it's hilarious because you just have that moment where you're like, John Constantine and Harley Quinn? No, John Constantine and a shark. All right. Well, whatever does it for you, John. You do you.
Yeah.
And have you read the Sandman books?
Unfortunately, not yet.
Okay. So, Wanda in A Game of You, which is the 5th volume, and by that point, Sandman was firmly entrenched in Vertigo and was not really part of the DCU anymore, but at the same time, it's been part of the DCU. It is currently part of the DCU. Sandman started in the DCU. So that's why I'm including this here, but I'm not including characters like Apollo and Midnighter, who were created back when Wildstorm was a part of Image. And so they were a completely separate comic book company when they were created. And Wildstorm is also one of those things that is in flux of whether it's considered part of the DCU or it's in its own separate universe. It constantly goes back and forth.
Yeah.
But Wanda in Sandman is the first trans woman we get, definitely in DC Comics, and I think maybe in either of the big two. And so that's a real breakthrough character there.
Yeah.
Obviously, I would recommend reading Sandman for any reader out there, as long as they are old enough. I do have some younger listeners to my podcast who should not be. There's definitely a lot of mature subjects handled in that book that they may not be ready for. But anybody who is 15 years or older, I would say, should read Sandman, and especially anybody who identifies as LGBT, because you have Wanda, who is just a regular person, just living in an apartment with some other characters, and like Pied Piper, just happens to be gay. Wanda happens to be a trans woman. Obviously, there's more of a deal made out of it. It comes up in the dialogue and in the plot a lot more than, say, Pied Piper as a counterexample. But at the same time, most of the characters we meet just accept her as she is and who she is. And so it's another positive representation, I think.
Yeah. Sounds like it. I'd be very interested in reading it when I eventually get around to Sandman.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's on my high recommend list for basically anybody. So when you get a chance, I definitely would suggest picking it up. And then the last of the Vertigo characters is Danny the Street from Doom Patrol, who is a street, is a sentient street. Have you seen the Doom Patrol series or read any of the books?
I've only seen the first 2 episodes of Doom Patrol. My girlfriend is very, very much a fan of the Doom Patrol show and the characters, but I have a passing familiarity with Danny the Street, and that I know that he exists.
Well, and you said but they actually identify as gender fluid and use they pronouns.
Oh.
It was very surprising when the show introduced the character, because it's just such an unusual concept of this is a sentient street that can go anywhere in the world and talks to people through their signs, like movie marquees or a chalkboard sign on the street or anything like that. That's how they communicate with everybody. But Danny is all about loving yourself and accepting who you are. And that's why they take in the people that they do. to live on the street with them. And they're a Grant Morrison character. Grant Morrison created Danny during their Doom Patrol run.
Danny seems to be a very like positive representation for like compared to Constantine. I mean, like Constantine's not bad representation, but like he is a very dark character.
Yeah, he's dark, immoral. He's not a role model. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Whereas Danny much more is someone you can look up to.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So let's go ahead and move forward and really move forward, because the next character I want to talk about is someone who is in the Legion of Superheroes, or at least was a supporting character in the Legion of Superheroes. And that's Siobhan Aaron. How familiar are you with her?
Not very, because I don't read much Legion of Superheroes.
Okay. So the storyline that I'm talking about is from the pre-Zero Hour. It's in, I believe, what's called the 5 years later period. And she is a member of the Science Police, which are basically the law enforcement of the 30th century. And she is in a romantic relationship with Element Lad. But we find out later that she is transgender, and that instead of surgery being how one would transition in the 30th century, there's a drug that is called Profem.
Okay.
And she was on this drug, and when Earth was kind of cut off from the rest of the United Planets, she no longer had access to Profem. And so basically started reverting back to being male. Obviously, this was very difficult for her, and she broke up with Element Lad because she felt that he wanted only her to be a woman, whereas Element Lad is a very open and accepting character who is all about, well, everything changes and everybody is who they're going to be at that moment, and was like, I really don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I love you no matter what your gender is. But she couldn't accept that. And so that was the end of their relationship.
Yeah, I think I've heard about this storyline. I haven't gotten the chance to read it, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think? What are your feelings when I explain it to you? How does it? Do you think that's? Do you think there's any sort of allegory there for?
Oh yeah, there is definitely allegory. Yeah, the Profem is very obviously and most likely intentionally a allegory for HRT, and like some people are trying to get a HRT cut off for trans people like me. That's relatable.
Yeah, unfortunate but true. And this was in the early 90s, or maybe even still the late 80s when this storyline came out. And so trans issues like this, were barely on the mainstream media's radar. So to have someone tell this kind of story was really kind of ahead of its time.
Yeah, it's definitely ahead of its time, and I'm glad it exists, at least, even if I haven't read it. Seems very important.
Yeah. So let's move forward to, more recent era comics are probably going to be stuff you're a little more familiar with. Why don't we move forward to Kate Kane,
Yeah,
aka Batwoman?
Yeah.
How familiar are you with her story, either through the comics or the show?
I know her from down the grapevine, unfortunately. I haven't gotten around to her yet, but yeah, Gwen, my girlfriend, she really does love Kate Kane, and as I understand it, Kate Kane was a romantic partner with Renee Montoya.
Yes.
And I do like Renee Montoya.
Oh, okay. I really love when they create a character in other media and then bring them into the comic books. And Renee is one of those characters who was part of Batman the Animated Series before she ever joined into the actual DC Comics universe.
Renee is this is probably a bit off topic, but she's like a bit of a fascinating character because she wasn't like given a lot of things to do in Batman the Animated Series. I think like the biggest thing she had, like episode she had, was POV.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, they really took her and made a bigger character out of like kind of a side character of the police department of Gotham.
Yeah, she was really just a minor supporting character, just a few lines here and there, other than that one episode POV, which is the animated series homage to Rashomon. But when they brought her into the DC universe, into the comics, they explicitly stated that she was a lesbian. And when they introduced Kate Kane in the 52 miniseries, which is one of my favorite DC stories ever, you can go back and listen to episode 52 of my show to find out why. But when they introduced Batwoman, they add to Renee's backstory that the two had been previously a couple.
Yeah. I mean, I am familiar with Batwoman's history. I do enjoy that they have made Kate Kane a lesbian because of Batwoman was created to like avoid the points that were brought up with the what is it, possession of the innocent or
Seduction.
seduction of the innocent?
Yeah, seduction of the innocent. Yeah. Why don't you go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah, Seduction of the Innocent was written by this child psychologist, I believe, who was basically saying that comics were corrupting your children into like violence and turning gay.
Specifically, the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson as, supposedly a homosexual relationship, and obviously one involving a minor, which would just be a crime.
Yeah.
But at that time, unfortunately, homosexuality and pedophilia were often conflated with one another.
Yeah. Yeah, after like accusing of like Batman and Robin being in a homosexual relationship, and horror comics like corrupting your children, and Wonder Woman being a dominatrix, which is partially true.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, it essentially the comics companies reacted by like forming their comics authority because like this book is kind of threatening our entire medium, so
yeah, I mean, there were comic book burnings at the time, and yeah, it was a big deal. And so, in an attempt to deflect some of those accusations, they made changes to the books. They created the Comics Code Authority, and they introduced characters like Batwoman, who was Kathy Kane and was specifically supposed to be a romantic interest for Bruce.
yeah.
Just to say, look, see, he's totally not gay.
Yes.
Everything's fine here.
See this straight woman. Yes.
And so, yeah, it's nice that they kind of turned that on its head in the modern age when they introduced Kate Kane and said, no. She is definitely not a romantic interest for Batman. She's
Yeah. Not even just representation point of view, but like from a storytelling perspective, making Kate a lesbian is probably the best way to make her distinct from Batman. Like let's just like, no, she's definitely separate from this.
Yeah, but at the same time, the fact that they were willing to make someone in the Bat family a proud and out member of the LGBT community says a lot for how far the comic industry has come in representing characters like that.
Yeah. Yeah, Kate Kane is cool, and so is Renee.
Now, the next pairing we have on the list that we made was one that you specifically wanted included. So, why don't you talk a little bit about Poison Ivy and Harley and why why you feel they were so important to include?
Yeah, Harley and Ivy's relationship is really important to me because of that's kind of how that is how I got to be with my girlfriend. We watched the Harley Quinn TV series together, and the relationship between them was like already canon within the comics, but like seeing that relationship just grow on screen and just like having like our lives just like mirror their lives just very oddly. I mean, without the a lot of gore, without all of the gore, but
Well, that's good.
yeah, it's yeah, we really connected with them and just like yeah, their relationship is very important to us.
Okay. And now Harley was originally introduced in the animated series, like Renee was,
Yeah.
and was originally Joker's girlfriend. But starting in the animated series, they had Harley kind of break things off with Joker, and she became her own woman. And that relationship between her and Ivy is again one of those things that kind of started in the animated series and then worked its way into the comics as well.
Yeah, there is like a very early Batman the Animated Series comic where like Batgirl is just like hinting just like, "Hey, are you and Ivy like you know, a thing?" Don't make me say it. Because of this is a children's comic quotation.
Right. Even though I think the average age of the animated series viewers was probably in the 20s at that point.
Yeah. So it's just like, yeah, this was like a very obvious thing from the beginning.
Yeah. And it seems so natural too, which is the really great thing about it is that they were both characters who were originally portrayed as being interested men, but their relationship with one another came about so naturally and just fit so well that there was never really any question of, oh, well, you're just taking a straight character and making him gay. Or I didn't see many, if any, of those complaints the way that there was around some other characters who were first portrayed as heterosexual and then later came out.
Yeah, like their relationship is just like a very natural progression for Harley and Ivy's character. Like there's when you like read comics and like watch the stuff, like you can just see like the road that the characters are like supposed to go down in your mind. Like Nightwing will become the next Batman, depending on what fan base you're a part of. Spider-Man will become like the head of the Daily Bugle and have a daughter, and then Harley will leave Joker and she will be in a happier relationship with Ivy. It's why I'm not a fan of when they try to make Joker and Harley a thing.
Yeah.
It feels regressive.
Oh, it really does.
I'm very thankful that they actually went through with the relationship because of who's to say that I'd have my girlfriend if they didn't.
Well, then I'm glad for you as well. It's a great show, and the fact that it has had that sort of effect on people in the real world is great to hear.
Yeah. But yeah,
we're not chatting on video, but I have this feeling that you're blushing.
yeah, I am. She's really important to me, and like that relationship is really important to me. So yeah.
Yeah. All right, but I think we may have said all we need to say about it for now. So why don't we move forward to almost definitely the most well-known character on this list, and one who, while they've been around for decades, has only recently actually identified as bisexual, and that is Wonder Woman. Which is kind of surprising considering she comes from an island of only women. But in those early adventures, it was always her and Steve Trevor. And so, although there was a lot of, at the time at least, in talking about the 30s and 40s, Wonder Woman was very progressive for its time and introduced a lot of, let's say, more alternative sexualities like polyamory and BDSM and that sort of thing in mostly subtextual ways.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until very recently that the writers of the comics were unafraid to say, yes, Diana is bisexual. She grew up with only women, and she loved women in that time, and she's loved men when she got introduced to man's world. And for her, it's not about gender, it's about the emotional connection.
It just makes sense, honestly, because like being raised for like depending on your timeline of Wonder Woman, either decades or hundreds of years on an island of women, it's just like yeah, it would make sense to like have a woman be interested in women.
Yeah.
And
You would think that the majority of, well, I don't know, it's weird because we know that sexuality is mostly an inherited trait. At least that's my understanding of it. I mean, people will say, I didn't choose to be gay, I was born gay. But at the same time, if your environment is one that there are no men, in some versions of her history, Diana didn't know about men until Steve Trevor arrived on the beach one day. So if you're raised in that environment, how does that change things?
yeah, I'm happy that like they went the route that they did with her sexuality because of like I'd imagine that they'd have the common sense of not doing what they do in the 30s if she liked women then, which would be like, oh, I'm going to cure you, quote, of being liking women.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, the creator of Wonder Woman probably wouldn't have done that, I don't think, based on on what we know of him and his relationships. But anyone who came in after that, yeah, if they'd tried to cover that subject, it most likely wouldn't have gone well up until very recent times.
Yeah. So I'm very appreciative of that. But I am happy that like one of the pillars of the DC universe is now an out bi woman.
Yeah, like I said, of the characters we've talked about here, either her or Harley Quinn is probably the most well known in the general public. And the fact that she is basically part of the DC trinity of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and that one of those three is an out bisexual woman is a very good step, is a very positive representation in the DC Comics universe.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple more characters I want to talk about, and they're specifically very recent additions. One is actually not part of the DC Comics universe yet, but will be in an upcoming issue. So, the first one I wanted to bring up is Alicia Yao, who is Batgirl's roommate in the recent Batgirl comics featuring Barbara Gordon. Have you read any of the appearances that any of the issues she's been in?
No, I unfortunately have not gotten around to it. There's just so many comics.
There really are.
Yeah, I know that she's, from what I can tell, a very good representation of a trans woman. And like that, the fact that actually like she's an unavoidable like art of Batgirl, just like she's her roommate.
Right. Yes.
It's like you can't really get that much unavoidable unless you marry Batgirl and her, so
right. And what I think is a good next step for trans representation is that I hope I say this without part of the reason I wanted to have somebody on here who actually is trans is because I want to say things correctly and not come off as ignorant. But she presents as female, and she had to sit down and talk with Barbara and say, by the way, now that we've gotten to know each other better, I wanted to let you know I am a trans woman. And Barbara is like, okay, well, thank you for telling me. I'm glad that we've gotten to the point in our friendship where you're able to be open with me about that. And she is a woman. There's no ambiguity about her at all.
There's no question about like that's a woman. Like
right.
Without even like what some people in the trans community call as passing, which has its own problem, but like you were like on the street and you saw her, you'd be like, oh, she's a woman, and some people might assume that she's cis, but you know, she's trans, and
right?
She's still a woman.
Yes, yeah, and that is the case with Alicia and I liked that, unlike Wanda in the Sandman books, it wasn't a part of who she was upon being first introduced.
Yeah,
it didn't define who she was, and so it wasn't until a few issues after she was introduced that we learned this about her, and that just added more to her backstory and to her character rather than it being her defining feature.
I'm looking forward to like actually seeing the character when I eventually get around to Batgirl.
Well, I would say start with Gail Simone's run if you're looking for a good place to pick up. She is one of my favorite writers, and she is the one who introduced Alicia into the supporting cast.
She seems a very positive representation, and I do follow Gail Stone off and on Twitter, so I know that she'd handle it well.
And then why don't we talk about the last one on the list here, and that is another character who came from outside of the comic books and is just now being introduced into the comics, and that is Dreamer, aka Nia Nal. Have you been watching the Supergirl TV show at all?
I have not, because unfortunately I cannot stand the Arrowverse.
Oh.
But my girlfriend, she watched Supergirl for Dreamer, and like from what I've heard from her, Dreamer is a very good representation and like just absolutely adores the character, and she wants the character to be in the comics, which thankfully will be happening soon.
Yeah, she's similar to Alicia in that, when we're introduced to her, we only see what is presented to us externally. She's not introduced as this is Nia Nal. She's a trans woman. It's here's Nia Nal. And it's only a few episodes down the line that she is willing to open up to her new friends and say, I want you all to know, because it's part of who I am, even if it's not immediately obvious upon seeing me. And she's come out to the public in the show as representing trans women. She is in universe considered a role model for trans women, and unlike Alicia or Wanda, she is a superhero. She is somebody you're to look up to, and to have a trans woman who is accepted as who she is and is presented as a good person to emulate is great. And the fact that she's played by a trans woman and that her first appearance in the DC universe is going to be written by that same trans woman. The actress, Nicole Maine, is going to be the one writing her first appearance in DC Comics. And so we'll actually have a trans woman writing about a trans woman in one of the big two comic book companies, which I think is probably a first.
Yeah, probably. And who to know the character best than the woman that's been playing her for probably years.
Yeah, for I think 3 years now. She was introduced in season 4, and I believe they're on season 6 or 7 right now.
Yeah, probably one of those.
Yeah. Although this is going to be the last season of Supergirl.
But thankfully, Dreamer has made the jump over to comics, so she's not stuck in canceled series limbo.
Yes.
Like some other characters.
Very true. And because the Arrowverse is still going, she could show up on Legends of Tomorrow or Flash or Superman and Lois, and she could continue her story in other series as well as also continuing to appear in the comics now that she's going to be making her appearance. The issue, for those who are interested in picking it up, it releases on June 8th, and it's an 80-page anthology titled DC Pride. And it is entirely LGBTQ plus creators and characters. Well, I think we've covered all the big ones that I wanted to talk about. Was there anything specific you wanted to discuss before we call it an evening?
Yeah, I feel like we should at least mention Catwoman.
Okay.
It doesn't really come up that often, but she is a bisexual woman, so it's just like yeah, we should probably bring up one of the biggest Batman villains.
That's true. Yeah, it is pretty rare that it comes up, especially right now with her having been almost married to Batman. But yes, she has definitely been out as a bisexual in the comics for varying periods.
It's one of those characters that feels like they haven't done that yet. Like with Wonder Woman.
Right. Yeah. Especially for someone like me who was a teenager when Batman Returns came out in theaters. Catwoman just oozes sexuality, and it seems to be such an important part of who she is and how she presents herself to the world.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we should definitely, since sexuality is, it seems to be an important part of her character, we should definitely mention that bisexuality is part of her character.
Yeah, I can't think of any other big DC LGBT characters that aren't headcanon or just like very, 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 very hinted at.
Right. There are characters who many fans will have a queer reading of a relationship between two characters that's never stated in the text. And as I discussed with you beforehand, I don't want to get into too many of those because you could do that with almost any pairing.
Yeah.
You could bring up almost any pairing, and I'm sure you can find some fan out there who will read it as a romantic relationship. And so, I wanted to stick with the canon characters, but at the same time, it is a valid reading.
Yeah.
For anyone to take those characters and to see their story represented in them, even if it's not presented in the text. It's perfectly valid to read that subtextually and to accept that as your own personal headcanon.
Yeah.
But because the person who asked the question wanted to know which ones fully represent them, I wanted to talk specifically about the ones who are in canon presented as belonging to the LGBT community.
Yeah, and like being a superhero kind of like goes with the territory. It's just like you're hiding a part of your life, so it's just like
Yeah.
that can be an allegory for being in the closet. So
Oh, definitely. And we're talking about DC in this one, but for instance, the X-Men characters, especially in the Bryan Singer movies, were very much an allegory for being gay. The whole "have you tried not being a mutant" line from the mother and things like that. It was not too difficult to put in that subtext. It was barely subtext and practically text at some points.
yeah. Yeah, I think that wraps it up for any other LGBT DC characters I can think of.
All right. So before we go, would you like to tell my listeners where they can find other projects that you've been involved with? Would you like to plug yourself, basically?
Oh boy, there's my YouTube channel, JennytheGeek, which I'll eventually upload to again.
And just a real quick comment, if you do a search, do Jenny the Geek, all one word, no spaces, and you'll find it much more easily. The first time I looked, I added the spaces and it didn't pull up, and so want to put that out there so that it's easier for people to find.
Okay. My Twitter handle is @JenTheGeek. I have a podcast that I'll eventually get back to, probably in the next month. called Cartoon Contrast Broadcast. You can follow us at Cartoon Contrast on Twitter, and I co-host that with my girlfriend. It's a cartoon cast about comparing adaptations and stuff that have cartoon adaptations.
Okay.
Like our most recent episode, I believe, was the Black Panther MCU movie versus Panther's Quest from the Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes series.
I haven't heard that yet, so I will definitely go and check that out.
And for my final plug, I have a Twitter account called @JensFreeHeroes, where I basically for replacements for copyrighted characters that you can use for your own stories if you want to make your fan fiction into something that you can actually sell.
I see. So you give away characters that are homages or analogs to more well-known copyrighted characters, and people are free to use those in their fiction so that they can then publish it without any worries of copyright infringement.
I mean, I'm not creating them. I'm just putting them out there.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me on this subject. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
That obviously wraps things up. As I mentioned during our chat, I'll revisit this topic and talk about other comic book companies' LGBT characters sometime in the future. However, starting next episode, we will be chatting about a Marvel character who does fall under that umbrella in more than one way, as I will be watching and reacting to Loki's new Disney Plus show, the first episode of which comes out this Wednesday. I'm going to try my best to get episodes of this show out over the weekend so that I'm not over a week behind in our discussion. Similar to my take on WandaVision, there will be a guest hanging out with me to bring a non-comic reader's perspective. In the meantime, don't forget to send in any questions you have that you would like answered in a future episode, or just comments on the show in general. Send any missives via email to welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.